Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Zara.
I'm Nandini. In the US, we've seen a shift among major corporations which are walking away from their commitments and policies around diversity and inclusion. Over the weekend, Meta, the parent company of Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, halted its diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, or DEI programs. Meta ending their DEI programs means rolling back diversity efforts when it comes to hiring new staff, working with suppliers, and increasing representation in leadership positions. Just last week, we saw McDonald's make a very similar move, and also Walmart towards the end of 2024.
Okay, so Nandini, the reason we're talking about this today is because over the weekend, Meta announced that they were walking back their diversity and inclusion practices. I want to first focus on them and then I guess go a bit broader and understand what is happening across the US that we're really seeing here. So just starting off with Meta, who we have really dedicated a lot of podcast space to recently. But anyway, what was their announcement over the weekend? What are the changes that they are pushing forward here?
So they issued a statement to their staff citing this shift in America's legal and policy landscape surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. It basically said the term DEI has become charged as it suggests preferential treatment of some groups over others. So Meta has maintained their stance that their principles are pretty much the same. They've said that we serve everyone, fairness and objectivity for all, and never making hiring decisions based on protected characteristics. These are things like ethnicity or gender.
Okay, so there's some pretty lofty language being used there. What are they actually doing though? Like, what is tangibly changing for people who are trying to be hired or work at Meta currently?
So firstly, they're no longer going to be using something called the diverse slate approach.
What's that?
And so this is basically a type of hiring method which involves a recruitment team going through applicants and making a pool of diverse candidates that sort of represents the diversity of an area through a pool of applicants. And then the chosen candidate is taken from that specific pool.
Okay.
Meta is saying that they're no longer going to use this approach and that instead they're going to continue to source candidates from different backgrounds. What approach they'll use, we don't know. Alongside changing their approach to ethnic diversity, though, Meta has also looked at gender-based initiatives. So the company has said that it's culling its representation goals for women and ethnic minorities. Meta said that these sort of goals can create the impression that decisions are being made purely on race or gender.
And that's what Meta's saying here. Okay.
Yeah, that's taken directly from their statement. The company also had a team that was centered on diversity, equity, and inclusion, which was headed by a woman named Maxine Williams. She is now being moved into a new position, which Meta says is going to focus on accessibility and engagement. Okay. So a change of language there and focus. So overall, Meta seems to be taking this blanket approach where instead of trying to improve diversity by focusing on certain minority groups, they are mitigating bias for all, their words, in the sense that they're focusing on everyone and just treating everyone equally. That's sort of the approach or angle that they're taking.
Now, Meta isn't the first company to announce changes around its diversity efforts. We saw a similar announcement from McDonald's last week, and I know that there was one from Walmart last year. Can you just provide, I guess, a bit of context on where this is all coming from? Why is this happening now? And what started this shift?
Let's go back real quick to the 1970s, and I want to focus on universities for a second, because the US Supreme Court made a decision that would allow universities to consider students' race when it comes to enrollment applications. This is what we call affirmative action.
Yeah.
Essentially, it aims to correct historic prejudices faced by minority groups by actively considering diversity when choosing and going through applicants.
And so in the US, this was the beginning, I guess, of the diversity quota conversation. And that was all around affirmative action. And that began happening at universities.
Exactly. And so several American universities then started to introduce affirmative action programs following this decision that was made about 50 years ago now. So that was sort of the lay of the lands. And then in 2014, a lawsuit came up led by an organization called Students for Fair Admissions. They took legal action against Harvard, alleging that affirmative action discriminates against white and Asian American students. Now, let's fast forward to June 2023, so about a year and a half ago, the US Supreme Court ruled in favor of banning affirmative action from university admissions. This means that universities had to shut down their affirmative action programs or entry schemes. When this decision was handed down, Donald Trump, who is now the president-elect, said that he would eliminate diversity programs.
To vigorously enforce yesterday's Supreme Court ruling, I will eliminate all diversity, equity, and inclusion programs across the entire federal government.
And so there has been a bit of time since the Supreme Court ruled against affirmative action in these educational institutions, whereas the kind of corporations moving away from DEI is more recent. Have we had any insights into whether it's changed how admissions look at universities since affirmative action was outlawed?
Yeah, so since this decision came through, a couple universities did release their enrollment data, which gives insight into the diversity and I guess the demographic of their new cohorts following the Supreme Court decision.
Yeah.
So in the case of MIT, that's the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the number of first-year Black students fell from 15% in 2023, before the decision, to 5% in 2024. That drop is about 2/3 of students. So that's the sort of data that we're seeing in the education space. And now the impacts of the affirmative action ban are sort of flowing on into the corporate space.
I will just clarify that the Supreme Court decision doesn't relate to corporates. It only relates to educational institutions, but it is more the kind of discourse that it is opening up, I guess. And clearly we are seeing this move now of corporates stepping back from their diversity and inclusion commitments. I mentioned before that McDonald's has done this. What was the rationale for their decision? What did they tell us about why they have done this?
Hello, Billy here from TDA. We have just looked at our YouTube analytics and 95% of you who are watching our videos aren't subscribing. If you want to help independent media like us grow, the best way you can do that is by pressing subscribe. Thank you so much, and back to the video.
So with McDonald's, they've cited this shifting legal landscape, which
So the same as Meta.
Which as you've mentioned, there's no requirement from the Supreme Court for corporations to pull back their DEI programs. But it's this sort of shift, this discourse that's happening that's now leading, in this case, McDonald's to pull back their DEI initiatives. And so something interesting that I found with McDonald's was they had previously set this goal where they wanted 35% of their US leadership roles to be held by people from underrepresented backgrounds. They've now said that that rate currently sits at around 30%, so 5% short of their goal. But McDonald's mentioned in their statement that they were no longer working towards specific targets for diverse representation in leadership positions. So this is one of their ways of pulling back on DEI. And similar to Meta announcing their changes with suppliers, McDonald's also said that they would be, quote, retiring their previous commitments to DEI with their greater supply chain.
You played a clip earlier of Donald Trump talking about getting rid of affirmative action. And I do think that it needs to be said that the timing of all of these announcements is, of course, in the lead up to Donald Trump's inauguration. And the tenor of kind of national conversation obviously changes with whoever is in the presidency. What have we heard from Trump? Is this going to be, I guess, one of his big policy platforms, or what role does the president have in something like this?
For sure. I think we are starting to definitely see some sort of shift, particularly as we near Trump entering office. And here's a little grab actually from what the president-elect said after Meta announced it was walking back on its DEI efforts just over the weekend.
You look at what happened with Facebook today and yesterday, what they announced, that was a big concession from them.
So this incentive to shift company practices away from targeted diversity initiatives isn't just coming from Trump. And I think we need to consider some of the people that Trump is surrounded by and the people who he has obvious close relationships with. Elon Musk is one of them, who has also stated that he's in favor of eliminating DEI programs.
If we lower the standards for doctors, such so that they, if the test for a doctor is lowered, then the probability of them making a mistake and killing someone is obviously going to be higher.
So just to recap, I guess, all the info that we've spoken about, there do seem to be a couple of different trigger points in this story. So there's a Supreme Court ban on affirmative action that relates just to educational institutions, and that's been in place since June 2023. But then we have had the president-elect Donald Trump talk about walking away from DEI programs, and he's had support from influential figures like Elon Musk. And now there's this growing trend that we're seeing of more and more companies, and not small companies, really, really big influential ones making similar decisions. Is that right?
Yeah, but it is important to also note that this isn't happening for every major company.
Yeah.
So over the weekend, Apple had released this official document ahead of their annual general meeting, essentially outlining proposals made by its shareholders. Now, one of the shareholders of Apple is a conservative think tank called the National Center for Public Policy Research, and it submitted a proposal to Apple for this general meeting, asking it to cease its DEI efforts, essentially pull back on its diversity programs, citing the Supreme Court decision, which is actually in the education sector, as we've mentioned, warning that Apple could be sued. Now, Apple's board said it recommended the other shareholders not to vote for this proposal because the company wasn't at risk of violating the Supreme Court decision and they weren't really at risk of getting sued. So Apple didn't really respond to the actual idea of walking back on their DEI programs, but they mainly said that the legal risk that this group was suggesting didn't actually exist. So in terms of whether or not Apple could be one of the next companies to make this move is very much up in the air.
But I mean, they haven't come out and supported it explicitly by any means. So it does seem like they're perhaps not going in the same direction as a Meta or as a McDonald's. Nandini, before we go, I do just want to ask though, you know, we talk a lot about the US. Oftentimes we can talk about importing Americanisms. It's this idea that what happens over there inevitably ends up over here. Do we see any Australian companies doing this sort of thing, walking away from diversity quotas or, you know, affirmative action is less of a term that's used here, but are we seeing anything like that here?
So far, we haven't seen any major companies announce changes in their commitments to diversity and inclusion in the workplace, and we haven't seen any changes in the university space either.
Yeah.
As for McDonald's Australia, a spokesperson told Sky News Australia that its doors are open to everyone. So in terms of McDonald's, which is a global company, looks like it might not be impacting it here in Australia just yet, or something to keep an eye on for sure.
Yeah, I mean, with Donald Trump coming to the presidency next week now, it'll be really interesting to see if other companies move away. Last time we spoke about Meta, we spoke about this idea of companies readying themselves for a Trump presidency. And it certainly feels like some of these decisions are in line with that. So we'll all be watching to see what happens in this space and whether there are any further changes. But thank you for explaining that. If you learned something from today's episode, why not send it to a friend? That is the way that our little media company can grow. We'll be back again this afternoon with some headlines. But until then, have a great day.